Okay, today I want to talk about the future of blockchain, the future of cryptocurrencies, and the Ethereum merge, a long-awaited upgrade to the popular crypto platform. And to help me discuss this topic, I'm joined today by Omid Malekan, who is a professor at Columbia Business School, the author of two books. The first one you published was the story of blockchain, and the new one, the latest one, is Re-Architecting Trust. So welcome, Omid.
Thank you for having me.
It's so good to have you with us. So where are you joining us from today?
I am in New York City.
Very good. So let's start this really wide. If someone asks you what is cryptocurrency, how would you explain this to someone?
Cryptocurrency is a fairly broad term that is used to describe a new class of digital assets that use a new kind of financial infrastructure known as blockchain. The first cryptocurrency, and still by far the most prominent, is Bitcoin. But in the decade or a little more since Bitcoin has been invented, we've seen many other kinds of cryptocurrencies be invented, some of them for wild new types of assets that couldn't exist otherwise, and some of them just better, more digital versions of the kind of assets that we're already familiar with.
Very good. So what makes cryptocurrency better than traditional financial assets, and where does it differ from what we could do in the past?
The biggest difference is that crypto is the first post-digital asset. And what I mean by that is that if you talk to people who are not too familiar with this world and you say, like, we now have these digital assets that we call cryptocurrencies, they're like, oh, but we already had like Venmo and credit cards, and my bank account has an app that I log into, or there are fintechs. And true as that may be, the interesting thing about 99% of the financial services that people use today is that while on the surface they might look digital, the underlying infrastructure and the architecture of that infrastructure has really not changed in many decades. A lot of it, including things like credit cards, is really like the same way that money and value used to be transferred when modern credit cards were first invented something like 70 years ago. It's just that now, instead of the store having to make a phone call to get the authorization, that's done via some kind of a physical gadget. So what excites me about crypto and why it's both, I think, so innovative and controversial is that it's the first time that we say, wait a minute, we now live in a world where everybody has some kind of a computing device in their pocket, almost everybody. And in fact, far more people have a smartphone than have a bank account. And we're all generally connected to the internet together. So how do we build a new kind of financial system? And how do we, as the title of my new book implies, how do we re-architect our existing infrastructure to really take advantage of what the digital domain offers?
So how do we do that?
Well, to break it down, like what makes something like blockchain as applied to, say, Bitcoin and Ethereum special? And I always like to compare them to the legacy system, just because crypto is new, but most people understand how a bank works. In the old world, we had this model where it's like, we need a ledger. Ledgers are actually one of the oldest human technologies that has ever been invented. There's even this theory that language, or written language, was originally created not for laws or poetry, but for accounting. So the temple could keep track of, who's deposited or donated how many cows or something like that. But the old architecture of ledgers was like, well, we need someone to maintain the ledger. So let's have a bank or a stock exchange, some kind of an intermediary do it. And then, hopefully they do a good job of it, but we have to trust them. It's very opaque. I can't open up my bank and inspect its books. The regulators that do that, but not on a real-time basis. And then like hopefully the bank has some redundancy. So hopefully like they don't have just one database that has all the ledgers of all the deposits and loans. Hopefully they have a couple of different data centers. Re-architecture starts with saying, wait a minute, now that everybody has a computer and some hard drive space, why don't we all keep a copy of the ledger? Right? Like it's possible. It was never been possible before in human history, but wouldn't it be a much more trustworthy financial system if I didn't have to rely on my bank to keep clean books? It's just me and 15,000 other people, many of whom are corporations and banks, decided to keep the same books. Right? So that's like this idea of a distributed system. Then we say, well, we now have this advanced cryptography that lets us lock down the contents of that database or that ledger, which for anyone who's worked in any industry where an audit trail matters is really important, right? It's really important that like whether by mistake or with malicious intent, you can't have some employee in a bank just go back and fudge someone's account balance or delete their information or something like that. Well, with modern cryptography, we can now make our distributed ledger immutable. So we got that. And then we can bring in these novel ideas of using incentives to have a more decentralized way of updating that ledger and authenticating transactions and whatnot. So that to me is like the fundamental difference between how crypto works and say how the banking system works. But the reason why I like to present it this way is that a lot of times people who are passionate about crypto argue on ideological grounds. Banks are evil, the dollar is bad, etc. And that argument appeals to some people, but it turns off a lot of people. So what I try to do is explain to them, like, look, if you think a database or a ledger is useful, would you rather have 3 companies have copies of it or everyone have a copy of it? And if you think an audit trail is important, would you rather not just use technology to lock down the content of that ledger? And if you think that economic inclusion is important, that anyone anywhere should be able to enjoy fundamental financial services, like having an account where they can make payments or receive a salary or being able to borrow a little bit of money as long as they're good for it or post collateral. If you think that these things are good, which universally most people do, then you're never going to get it from the old way of doing things. And that's why blockchain and crypto in the long run is going to be the winner.
Okay, that makes sense. The challenge is we have lots of challenges. One is that cryptocurrency at the moment is more used as a gambling asset rather than a proper currency. So we need some stability in this to make it work in the future, I guess. And that the underlying blockchain technology is still evolving. There are, as you said, competing blockchains that use different technologies. The 2 biggest ones are Bitcoin and Ethereum. Do you want to outline how they differ?
Sure. The original goal of Bitcoin was to actually, if anybody goes and rereads the original Bitcoin white paper, which I actually recommend everybody try, you'd be surprised. It's only 8 pages, and you don't need to worry about the technical stuff. But a couple of things that stand out to me about it that are interesting is like how simple it is, and also how non-ideological it is. It's just like that was whoever Satoshi was. It was someone trying to solve an intellectual problem, which is how do you build a payment system without having an intermediary. And Bitcoin has become that. It is this global 24/7 real-time payment system that anybody can access. Anybody can get the coin and send it to anybody else. The biggest knock against it, as you alluded to, is the fact that it is very volatile. So it's not that useful for things like day-to-day shopping. And we'll see if that resolves with time. Ethereum, on the other hand, takes that idea and expands it significantly and said, wait a minute, if we're going to build this decentralized and distributed ledger that is a better way to do economic interaction, why don't we do more with it? And specifically two things. One, instead of just having one coin, a native coin, which is the coin that is used to reward the miners or validators, which if Bitcoin has Bitcoin and Ethereum has ETH. Ethereum gives you the ability to have an infinite number of arbitrary valuable stores. That's what we call a token. And a token could literally be anything. It could be another cryptocurrency. It could be a dollar. It could be a stock. And with things like non-fungible tokens, it could be art or a ticket to an event or a collectible. And that's like the cool thing about Ethereum, that you could literally show up and be like, I have a crazy idea for some crazy new asset that's never existed before. And you write 5 lines of code, and now your asset gets to ride this global, reliable financial infrastructure. The second thing Ethereum offers is this idea of smart contracts, a admittedly poorly named concept, because smart contracts are not like the blockchain version of real world contracts or legal contracts. Smart contracts are just conditional payments where the same users that can issue or own an infinite variety of arbitrary stores of value called tokens could also write code where the miners or validators enforce conditions. If this happens, then a coin or a token goes from me to you. And the remarkable thing about that is that you can rebuild almost all existing financial services with smart contracts. Because if you think about like what most of us do in life, right? Like it's the first of the month, you pay rent. If something happens, you collect an insurance premium. Any kind of financial derivative, like what is an options contract? If it's expiration day and if this stock is trading above this price, I pay you money. So you can replicate all of that with smart contracts. And as it turns out, not only can you do, in some ways, a much more better and trustworthy job of replicating existing financial services, you can also invent some pretty cool and novel different solutions, decentralized applications, what have you. So those are the two biggest differences between Bitcoin and Ethereum. And then the third one, which is soon upon us, hopefully, is that whereas Bitcoin and Ethereum use the same kind of security model called proof of work that was invented by Satoshi Nakamoto, sometime in the next few weeks, if all goes well, Ethereum is going to transition to a different kind of security model called proof of stake.
Very good. And why the one of the main reasons they're doing it is to reduce the energy consumption. That proof of work requires a lot more energy to run. Proof of stake doesn't. Do you want to very briefly explain the difference between these two and why this is the case?
Yes. The fundamental challenge of building any kind of a decentralized payment system is this question of like, who validates transactions and prevents fraud, basically? Like, who prevents one person from cheating somebody else, say by sending 2 people the same coin at the same exact moment in time? In traditional finance, that's why we have intermediaries. That it's PayPal's job to make sure that Venmo users don't do that, and if they do, then PayPal takes a hit, but then they get to charge a lot of money for providing that security. With Bitcoin, this novel solution came up of like, well, let's have volunteers do that, and anonymous volunteers, which sounds crazy on the surface, right? Like, we're going to have anonymous volunteers do the most important job of preventing fraud on the network. And this is where every previous attempt to build digital currency before Bitcoin had failed. It was like, we need an intermediary, but then if we have an intermediary, then what have we really achieved? The solution that we now call proof of work is this basic idea is that, yeah, we're going to have volunteers do this, but first we're going to ask them to waste money. And that's really what Bitcoin mining is that in order to have these volunteers prove honest intent and have some skin in the game, we ask them to waste money on electricity. Specifically, they're trying to solve a cryptographic puzzle, the details of which are not important, but the actual doing of collecting transactions and writing the next block of the blockchain is arbitrarily easy. I can do that on my desktop computer. This industrial mega mining that uses a lot of power all over the world, that's part of the security, so the miners get skin in the game. because now they've spent dollars or euros or Chinese yuan on electricity. And then if they do a good job, they get paid in Bitcoins based with transaction fees and inflation. So we've aligned incentives. The greediest miner is the most honest miner because that's how they make the most money. There are actually, like today, many ways where somebody who's rich enough can attack Bitcoin. It just so happens that they'll make less money attacking it than doing an honest job of mining. So that's proof of work, but it does have, as you alluded to, this energy consumption problem, especially now that the world is in an energy crisis and the resulting environmental impact, ESG, etc. Proof of stake was a more recent idea that said, well, if we want someone to prove honest intent, instead of having them waste money, why don't we have them put the money up in escrow with the network? So in proof of stake, if you want to be, we don't call them miners, we call them validators, but they do the same thing. They take some of the coin they buy some of the coin of the network, which in this case will be ETH, and then they lock it up in escrow with the network, and then they do the job of creating blocks and attesting to their content and whatnot. And then if they do a bad job, then they get slashed, which means they lose their escrow. But if they do a good job, they get rewarded in the form of transaction fees and a little bit of inflation. So that's like the fundamental difference. And then there are other interesting consequences on things like decentralization.
Okay, which are?
So Bitcoin is very decentralized, which I think is great, but also almost to a fault, meaning like Bitcoin's never going to change. So if the energy crisis really worsens, which I hope it doesn't, then we might have a problem as a community where like some of the backlash we get from governments and whatnot is going to get a lot worse if they're like, look, there are people in Europe who can't heat their home and there's still Bitcoin mining going on. There's a lot of nuance to it because a lot of Bitcoin mining is using trapped power and renewable power that you can't use for anything else. But anyway, politically, it's an issue. But it's decentralized because you have in Bitcoin, you have people who own a lot of coins, who have nothing to do with miners. And then you also have like the exchanges and the custodians. So you have these different power centers, which keeps things decentralized, also makes it hard to upgrade. That's one of the reasons Bitcoin never changes much. In Ethereum or with any proof of stake blockchain, the people who own the most coins also they're the most likely to be the validators. Because why wouldn't they? This is a fairly easy way to earn a return on their coins. And there are places where coins are already heavily concentrated, like exchanges and custodians. So if you think about it almost politically, in Bitcoin, there's a lot more system of separation of powers and checks and balances, or with proof of work in general. With proof of stake, you tend to get more concentration, which, mind you, cuts both ways because that does mean that you can upgrade the infrastructure more. You have an easier ability to deal with any kind of a major problem or crisis. The politics are not going to be as cantankerous. However, the downside is that you have sacrificed some level of decentralization to get there.
Okay. So what will happen to the miners that currently work on the Ethereum blockchain?
So because everything in this world is decentralized, nobody has to do anything. And there is some likelihood that when the rest of the network moves to proof of stake, and your listeners might want to know why we call it the merge. The reason why it's called the merge is that Ethereum launched a separate proof of stake blockchain over a year ago, and just like to see how it runs and work out the kinks and stuff. So it's the merge because we're now going to merge the original proof of work blockchain with what we call the beacon chain, which is the new proof of stake chain. And most of the community is fully behind this. However, the miners have a problem because they're not going to be able to whatever hardware they have and cheap electricity they have and whatnot is not going to be very useful or useful at all in a proof of stake chain, because it's no longer about the hardware or power. It's about just owning some coins, which anybody can do from anywhere. So there is some likelihood that they will try to continue mining the proof of work chain. And this has happened before in crypto. It happened before to Ethereum with the DAO hack 5-6 years ago. There have been many forks of Bitcoin where a group of miners go say, we're going to go do a different Bitcoin now. So they'll try that. We'll see if it works. There are many reasons why that chain will automatically just be broken. For example, like stablecoin issuers have already said, like, we're not going to, our stable coins on the old chain are instantly going to become worthless because we're not going to redeem them for dollars. And that'll break DeFi and some other things. So, and they also will, the miners will, it's not enough for them to keep mining the proof of work chain. There is something called a difficulty bomb, which is like a pre-programmed way of making proof of work mining increasingly impossible in order to push people to the proof of stake chain. So the miners will now have to like coordinate to fork again to prevent that from happening and all that. We'll see if it works. Even if it does, though, like all the action is going to go on the proof of stake chain, which probably means in the long run, I think the majority of today's Ethereum miners are just going to have to go figure out something else to do.
Okay, so this will put Ethereum in a more competitive position, I guess, especially when it comes to institutional investors. What's your view on that?
Yes, for a couple of reasons. One, the ESG narrative, which many institutional investors do care about. The environmental impact of proof of work might have been a deal breaker for some, but now they say, oh, well, this number 2 blockchain doesn't have that problem. Also, with staking, you get an inherent yield, since anyone really can stake, and there are services popping up that let anybody just like go click from your wallet, and now you're participating in staking. Some service providers like doing the hard work technologically, for which they're going to take a cut of their profits. But in a proof of stake chain, it becomes sort of like a risk-free rate on Ethereum. So there's yield, which generally institutions find appealing. And then the third thing is that while the merge itself will not do much to increase Ethereum's throughput and bring fees down, it does set up a series of future upgrades, which, if all goes well, will theoretically expand Ethereum's capacity far beyond anything that Bitcoin could ever handle for all sorts of transactions and smart contracts. And perhaps institutions will be like, oh, well, the future viability of Ethereum is now greater in my eyes.
How far away do you think we are from a stable cryptocurrency that is not used purely as a speculative asset?
Are we including stablecoins in that question or not?
Yeah.
I think the stablecoin thing is actually a lot closer than some people think.
So do you want to quickly explain the difference between a stablecoin and others?
Yeah, another unfortunate term in crypto. But stablecoins are basically like fiat money on the blockchain. So your existing dollars, euros, yen, but using this new infrastructure for transactions, as opposed to like Venmo, credit cards, or the banking system, which in the new book, I have a whole chapter on why I think there's an inevitability to this. There's just so many ways in which using the blockchain to move fiat money around is better and more appealing than Venmo, banks, or credit cards. So, and so far, stable coins too, while they've grown exponentially, I think there's now something like close to $200 billion worth of them on various blockchains, mostly Ethereum. Most of that has been for crypto speculators, people buying Bitcoin or like levering up on ETH or something. But I think we're on the precipice now where they start to gain adoption for just vanilla money applications. Examples include there are many people all over the world who would love to be able to save in dollars in places like Turkey and Argentina and Iran. Today, they have no choice but to like go to some back alley and get physical $100 bills at a 30% markup. With stable coins, they'll be able to just use a digital blockchain wallet and just need to know someone who has some or go to an exchange. And there's already some anecdotal evidence that this is starting to happen in places like Latin America. And then for other kinds of payments where the existing banking system is just so limited, for things like remittances, or anytime I have to send a wire transaction, I just find this process of like filling out this form and all these questions, like the beneficiary's account, the bank address. And I start my class, which I start next week. I'm going to go through the process of trying to open up a bank account and send the wire live. And then I'm going to just initialize an Ethereum wallet and get some stable coins. And I'm just going to pose the questions to the students, like, which do you think is better? So I think, going back to your original question, because stable coins are inherently stable, they're now like at a tipping point of adoption for all sorts of things that have nothing to do with crypto. As for the pure cryptos like Bitcoin and ETH, I think we're still a fair ways away from where they might have the kind of stability that like the dollar does or gold does. And that's partly because, yes, they are currencies in a form of money, but they're also like startups. And any startup faces a lot of uncertainty. It's just normally startups don't have liquidity and trading and price discovery from day one. So you don't see the volatility. In crypto, you do, which has interesting consequences. But by the time we get to the point where we say like, oh, Bitcoin's now a relatively stable global asset, a lot of the technological innovation and fun and disruption might be behind us. So for those who have an interest in this, I don't care if people invest in Bitcoin or not, but intellectually, or like a business idea or how it might impact their business, I would encourage them, don't wait until everything's built out and everything's stable. By then it's too late and your competition would have won already.
So when you advise businesses, I've got lots of business leaders listening and watching my conversations. What would be your main bit of advice? How should they approach this whole Web3 world, blockchain world? What are your top tips there?
One of the things I had to learn to do when I was first introduced to Bitcoin many years ago was to let go of my existing way of thinking about how things worked. And I come across a lot of business leaders who keep trying to like take their existing business or business model and then cram it into blockchain. And that's not really going to work. That's not how disruption works, right? Like that to me is a little bit like the analogy is when digital video and music first came out, we put it on a physical device, right? Like you got a CD or a DVD and you had to go to a store, and now you're getting a digital thing from the store as opposed to a VHS. That worked in the short term, but really like the killer app was streaming video and music. And like if even in the 1990s, you were better off figuring out how to do that than worrying about like, oh, I need to have a warehouse full of DVDs. So number one is let go of your existing way of thinking and try to really embrace what the technology makes possible that's not possible today. Number two is you have to learn, and the best way to learn is to play. Because people always ask me, what class do I take? What who do I follow on Twitter to learn? I'm like, there's an infinite number, but really like just take $100, go initialize an Ethereum wallet. I just talked about stable coins. Try to get a stable coin and send it to your friend. Or if you're interested about Web3 or NFTs or something, go just mess around in some of these communities. You will learn more doing that than reading anything, with the exception of my book, which I also highly recommend. But all kidding aside, I wrote the new book with your kind of audience in mind. Open-minded, but reasonably skeptical people who don't want to be preached to, who do not have a technology background, but are genuinely curious, like, how is the world going to change and how can I figure out how to evolve my business for it?
So have you got any examples that showcase how industries might be affected, how business models will be disrupted by Web3, by blockchain technology?
Yes. Depending on how long of a timeline. If we're taking like a 20-year timeline, then my working thesis is that any platform business where the primary value of the business is to bring A and B together, which is, that's what social media is. Like, what is YouTube? It's a place where content creators and content consumers come together. What is Venmo? It's a place or PayPal, it's a place where people who want to pay money and businesses who want to receive money come together. And these happen to be, by the way, the most valuable assets on earth today, these platform companies, because of all the cliches that everyone's heard of, network effects and Metcalfe's law and all of that. I think in 20, 30 years, all of these platforms will be somewhat decentralized, just because it leads to a better world, a better model, and more value goes to A and B if there is no C standing between them. And just like to go back to the example of a Venmo or a Visa or something, these are highly profitable companies. Their profit margin is stablecoins opportunity, to paraphrase Jeff Bezos. And in time, people and businesses will say, hey, if I figure out how to accept these digital dollars, I'm not paying 3% to a bank and Visa for every single credit card swipe anymore. That's a lot of money across the span of the year. So that's the long-term vision. In the short term, as I'm sure you know, it's really hard to figure out how we get there, particularly if we were talking about like decentralized social media and stuff like that. So in the short term, I'm more curious about what are the tangential benefits that a limited application of Web3 could provide to an existing business, because that gives us a roadmap. And a perfect example of that is the fact that Facebook and Twitter have began integrating NFTs into their service. So now if you happen to own some digital collectibles, you can show them off in your Instagram page in a verified way. That's interesting to me, because it's like, this is a technology that might someday replace Facebook, but here's Facebook embracing it. Why? Because they feel like their customers would like it. Also, like, I also fully expect some of these payment providers to get into the stablecoin game in the next couple of years, even though, again, it's like I can send a stablecoin for a lot cheaper than a PayPal payment. But why is PayPal going to do that? Potentially, in a couple of years. There's been rumors about a PayPal stablecoin, so that's why I'm using it as an example. But it's like, they're like, oh, well, I have 26 million merchants and 400 million customers today, but with a stablecoin, I might have 2 billion customers. And if payments are free, it's going to enable 10,000 different services that I can use the payments as a loss leader. Like, maybe now future merchants need custody, and maybe they need someone to program smart contracts and data and analytics and regulation and compliance. And that for 2 billion customers, that could be a killer business. So this is where I think the next couple of years is going to be interesting to watch. And then I think for like the kind of business leaders who listen to your show, this is the thing for them to think about. Like, is there some limited application of NFTs today that just make the experience they provide their customers a little better? And that could really be just like a digital coupon that has an artistic component to it that also gives them access to some kind of exclusive event that happens every 6 months. You start with that becomes value additive to your current business model, and then it sets you up to eventually transition to the more Web3 centric business model.
And this is a great picture of the future. Some people might think that this is also maybe a bit naive, that you think actually we can skip all of those platform businesses that take a big chunk of our profits, and in the future we can just trade one-to-one and eliminate some of these costs. Do you think there will be other gatekeepers in the future that will be able to take some of those profits?
Yes, I wouldn't call them gatekeepers, but I'm glad you asked this question, because I actually do not believe in this crypto utopian vision that in the future everything will be decentralized and like everyone's going to own every token and we're all going to vote on every protocol. That's just not how human society has ever worked.
No.
It's highly inefficient. The frictions are a nightmare. Governance already happens in a lot of these crypto projects, like grinds down to a halt or falls apart, because crypto keeps relearning the lessons of history. Like there's a reason why we don't have direct Greek style democracy in America. and it has to do with the fact that like people don't want to vote. People are busy. And even me, right? Like I work in this industry. I own some tokens that give me voting rights. I just can't keep up. So I think in the future, the Web3 model will be in one way very similar to today, where it's very hierarchical. There are many reasons, and I outlined this in the new book, why everything tends to be a hierarchy: government, the legal system, the banking system, even social systems. Hierarchies are very important for trust building in an efficient way. And I think the future of crypto is going to be deeply hierarchical. And I'll give you a simple example of that. Even with Bitcoin today, most people don't run their own node, meaning have their own copy of the ledger. And most people don't even have their own private keys or wallet. Like most people just trust a traditional corporation like a Coinbase to do that for them. And I think that's fine. In fact, I think that's better because frankly, like I would be very concerned if my mother had to worry about backing up her private key. The risk of her making a mistake and losing her retirement is just too high. I want her to have some kind of a trusted corporation who will hold her hand and help her protect her assets. And I think this will be true for all Web3, right? Like, I don't think if decentralized social media takes off, it will not be this egalitarian, everybody controls everything. We're going to have companies like Instagram and Facebook and Twitter be how the 99% of users access some protocol that lies at the heart of them. But when I say this now, the crypto people usually say, oh, but then what's the point? We have replicated the old way of doing things. But I don't agree with that, because I think there's going to be a couple of features that the new hierarchies have that still make them much better. One is they're going to be far more transparent. Like we have no idea what the algorithms that Twitter and Facebook use today, how they work, but we have a strong sense that they're not good in promoting radicalization and polarization and stuff. If in the future we'll have transparency, even if we access this like decentralized social protocol through Twitter, we know what the protocol is doing and we know what Twitter is doing. And if we don't like what they're doing, we switch. And we'll be able to do that because the other thing that the new hierarchy has or will have is this idea of censorship resistance, which is that anybody will be able to do anything. And I think like one of the reasons why it's fine that most people access Bitcoin through Coinbase is that anyone can start a new crypto exchange or wallet service tomorrow. You and I, if we wanted to do that, we would just write some code, and because the Bitcoin protocol is censorship resistant, we can build a business on top of it. That I don't know what it takes to like build a new something on top of the Wall Street based stock clearing in New York. Like to be a competitor to the New York Stock Exchange, I'm sure it takes a lot more than just like two guys writing some code. Like I imagine it takes a massive amount of money, a decade, and the kind of political connections that I don't know about you, but I definitely don't have. So that's the vision of Web3 that I think we're going to evolve.
Interesting. What do you see as the biggest barriers that we need to overcome? I guess what I'm seeing is that there are very powerful corporations that are threatened by all of this, and organizations and governments. There are lots of governments that want to control the currencies in their countries, and they see it as a real threat that if stablecoins become easily accessible and mainstream, that it devalues local currencies. There's a huge risk for all the middleman organizations that you've talked about, be it PayPal, Venmo, banks, insurance companies, and so on. And at the moment, there isn't really any clear regulation, any roadmap. How do you see this all working out?
So I think those are all spot on, and it's going to be it's going to take time, and it's going to be very messy. There are going to be countries that basically start throttling their own internet and doing other things just to choke off access to things like stable coins. Even in the US with things like the tornado cash sanctions and stuff like that. That's a lot of the US government trying to flex over what could someday, I think, actually become a rival to the dollar banking system, which most of the global economy revolves around. All of that said, we've been through this before. A lot of entrenched forces and governments try to stop every technological wave that came, including like the early days of digital communication and cryptography. It wasn't that long ago that the US government wanted to install a backdoor in every PC sold in America, literally, so the NSA could read your emails if it wanted to, regardless of what kind of encryption you used. They lost that battle, in part because A, it was stupid. It wouldn't have stopped any criminals from doing anything criminal, but it would have made everybody in America less secure. And B, it's a competitive world, and that would have mean that like no foreign government would ever buy American computers, and there would have been no Apple or Dell or Microsoft. So there's the crypto version of this. One government will try to crack down, and another one says, "Oh, come build your exchange or business here. I'll let you do whatever you want to do because I see the growth potentials." That's one barrier. Another barrier is I think a lot of the UI, UX of crypto is still really terrible. I was just trying to bridge some coins from some blockchain to another yesterday, and I was like, God, like we really have to figure out better workarounds for this stuff, particularly around the key management bit. The write down the 24 words and hide the piece of paper and don't give it to anybody. That's not going to scale globally. And that's being worked on a lot, which is great. And then the third thing is we do need to figure out those orthogonal business models or solutions and stuff. Like I know people who've tried to build decentralized social media for years. And it's basically like take what Twitter does and introduce a token and have some governance around it and let people earn money for curating and creating content, which I was a big believer in, still am, but it hasn't taken off at all. Mm-hmm. So that could mean the world is not ready for it. Maybe this is like the Apple Newton. We need another 5-10 years before the iPhone is ready for mainstream adoption. But it could also mean that maybe like there's some completely different Web3 models that involve AR and other things that I'm not an expert in that are going to be completely different from the Web2 model, and that will lead to mass adoption.
Very good. Looking at this whole space of cryptocurrencies, blockchain, Web3, what are your hopes for the future when you look at this space?
In terms of progress or like what it means for society?
Both.
I think I am particularly passionate about the economic inclusion possibilities here because a critique that I'm sure you've heard a lot is like, why do we need Bitcoin or stable coins? The existing system works fine. And it's always telling to me that that's usually an affluent person in a developed country who would even like dare to think that. And even then, I tell them like, go to your local corner bodega where they say minimum $10 for a credit card payment and ask them how the system is working. Or anybody who like, it still takes 2 days to get your paycheck after you've been paid. It's absurd. And if like those 2 days fall over a weekend, it takes 4 days. And it's again, I go, why? But there are billions of people all over the world and tens of millions of people, even in developed countries, who do not have access to basic financial services and never will based on the rules and the architecture of the existing system. So I'm very excited to see, like, what does a world look like where anybody who has a phone or a computer has a wallet and they instantly get to make payments and receive payments in real time, and build businesses like that, take out microloans, and then use things like NFTs to actually accentuate whatever their value offering is. I think that's going to be revolutionary, and in some ways, perhaps even more transformative than the internet itself. Because having access to all the information in the world is not that helpful if you don't have access to value transfers and financial services. So I'm very hopeful to see that. And then I'm also just hopeful for like the new enablers. You know, like we've seen NFTs do things for creators and digital artists that were otherwise thought impossible. And I just happen to have, being in New York, I have a lot of friends who are musicians and artists and stuff. And for some of them, they're still trying to figure out, but they're like, oh, like I've always liked to create images, and now I can sell them on a blockchain and make a little bit of money. And if every time it trades hands, I make a little bit more money, that could literally change that person's life.
Yeah, 100%. I've had some really interesting conversations recently with some NFT artists that anyone can rewatch on my YouTube channel or podcast, that really illustrates the power of this technology. Omid, thank you so much. That was super interesting. Thank you for spending time with me today and with our listeners and viewers. As always, anyone who wants to re-listen to this, head to my YouTube channel or subscribe to my podcast, where you find hundreds of other engaging conversations around the future of business and technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.